at that time hanging in the balance, and with Congress about to vote in 1 week on whether or not it should authorize George Bush to go to war in Iraq, what could possibly be worse? And I repeat, what could possibly be worse and more criminal than the Bush administration deliberately keeping this all-important conclusion from Congress and the American people? The terrible reality is that the Bush administration has gotten away with thousands upon thousands of murders. And we, America, the American people, cannot let them do this. During the
and a look back at 9/11, some facts we know and some more we'd like to find out about on this edition of North Bay Report. Most of us can probably remember where we were during the events of 9/11. But how sure are you about the events that led up to the incident? Some are questioning the government's account, and one of them is our guest. Dr. Bob Bowman joins us. He's a retired Air Force colonel. Thanks for stopping by.
You're welcome. Good to be here.
A little bit about your background first before we talk about some of the things that you have to say. Who are you?
Well, as you said, Lieutenant Colonel USAF, retired, flew 101 combat missions in Vietnam, directed all the Department of Defense Star Wars programs under Presidents Ford and Carter. My PhD is in aeronautics and nuclear engineering from Caltech. I've chaired 8 major international conferences. That's probably enough.
Yeah, no, but you also were looking at a congressional seat?
Oh, yes, I ran for Congress in 2006, came pretty close, but I was beaten in the end by my 7-term incumbent Republican opponent and his Diebold touchscreen voting machines.
Well, needless to say, you have some background in the federal government.
Absolutely.
And you are questioning a little bit about some of the accounts of what led up to 9/11?
Well, sure. We haven't been told the truth. I've talked to both Governor Kane and Congressman Hamilton, the co-chairs of the 9/11 Commission report, and they admit that there are outright falsehoods in their official 9/11 final report, a report tightly controlled by the White House, written by Philip Zelikow, a White House flack. So it doesn't tell the story. It doesn't even address most of the questions. Doesn't tell why Building 7 came down, which wasn't even hit by an aircraft, in what appears to be a perfect controlled demolition. Not only doesn't answer the questions, it doesn't even ask many of the pertinent questions. Beyond that, beyond the cover-up of the report, when you combine that with confiscation of audio tapes, videotapes, black boxes and other evidence by the FBI, it's clear that regardless of who was responsible for 9/11, the subsequent cover-up was itself a conspiracy involving elements of the White House and the intelligence establishment.
Well, Dr. Some would say, what you don't know won't hurt you. Now, the general public out there may not want to know a lot of the things you're talking about because they understand there were some terrorists, they understand there were some buildings, things went down, and there was a great deal of loss of people and a tragedy in the United States. They may not want to know a lot about the things.
Well, we have to do that because the Bush administration exploited that tragedy to deceive us into illegal, unnecessary wars of aggression in Afghanistan and Iraq. Whether or not anyone in the government was involved in killing almost 3,000 people on 9/11, the Bush administration is directly responsible for the loss of over 3,500 young American soldiers in Iraq, more in Afghanistan, to say nothing of hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians. Now, this is an impeachable offense and an act of treason. I said so before the war started. It still is. We know that this war, and I said this before it started, has absolutely nothing to do with national security or freedom or democracy or human rights or weapons of mass destruction or protecting our allies or disarming Iraq. It has to do with money, it has to do with oil, and it has to do with raw imperial power, and it is wrong. And Congress should immediately impeach Dick Cheney and George W. Bush for deceiving us into this war costing so many thousands of lives. And then we can end the occupation of Iraq and prevent another attack, perhaps a nuclear attack on Iran, which the Bush administration admits they want to do. But we mustn't let them get away with it.
You have a petition, or there's a petition circulating, is there not, for this investigation you're talking about?
A lot of people are clamoring for a new investigation of 9/11, a new I'm asking for an investigation of the cover-up. And more importantly, I'm asking for impeachment based on the exploitation of 9/11. Whether or not anybody in the United States had anything to do with it or not, they have exploited it for their own financial reasons, having nothing to do with national security. They have sacrificed the lives of over 3,500 of our young men and women in Iraq. And if that isn't a treasonable, impeachable offense, I don't know what is.
Yeah, you're talking about, obviously, integrity here, or something much deeper, because the president's going to be termed out. He's going to be gone anyway. So impeaching him...
Yeah, but he's got over a year to do more damage, including a possible nuclear attack on Iran, which I believe would destroy the United States as we know it. I mean, we have already lost so many of our friends, so much of our credibility around the world, so many of our allies. If we did that, Russia and China would turn against us for sure. We'd be isolated in the world completely, and rightly so, as the #1 rogue nation on earth.
Well, you've just touched, I think...
We've got to save our country.
I know, it's just like you've touched on the tip of what it is that you like to say. Website, how can people find out more?
www. If you want, thepatriots.us.
Okay. Dr. Bob Bowman, a retired U.S. Colonel, Air Force Colonel, and we'll be back. Well, that's it for this edition of North Bay Report. Until next time, I'm Curtis Kim. Thanks for watching.
And I tried hard to be proud of my service, but all I could feel was shame. And racism could no longer mask the reality of the occupation. These were people, these were human beings. I've since been plagued by guilt anytime I see an elderly man, like the one who couldn't walk, who we rolled onto a stretcher and told the Iraqi police to take him away. I feel guilt anytime I see a mother with her children, like the one who cried hysterically and screamed that we are worse than Saddam as we forced her from her home. I feel guilt anytime I see a young girl, like the one I grabbed by the arm and dragged into the street. We were told we were fighting terrorists. The real terrorist was me, and the real terrorism is this occupation. Racism within the military has long been an important tool to justify the destruction and occupation of another country. It has long been used to justify the killing, subjugation, and torture of another people. Racism is a vital weapon employed by this government. It is a more important weapon than a rifle, a tank, a bomber, or a battleship. It is more destructive than an artillery shell, or a bunker buster, or a Tomahawk missile. While those weapons are created and owned by this government, they are harmless without people willing to use them. Those who send us to war do not have to pull a trigger or lob a mortar round. They do not have to fight the war, they merely have to sell the war. They need a public who is willing to send their soldiers into harm's way. They need soldiers who are willing to kill and be killed without question. They can spend millions on a single bomb, but that bomb only becomes a weapon when the ranks of the military are willing to follow orders to use it. They can send every last soldier anywhere on earth, but there will only be a war if soldiers are willing to fight. And the ruling class, the billionaires who profit from human suffering, care only about expanding their wealth, controlling the world economy. Understand that their power lies only in their ability to convince us that war, oppression, and exploitation is in our interest. They understand that their wealth is dependent on their ability to convince the working class to die to control the market of another country. And And convincing us to kill and die is based on their ability to make us think that we are somehow superior. Soldiers, sailors, Marines, airmen have nothing to gain from this occupation. The vast majority of people living in the U.S. have nothing to gain from this occupation. In fact, not only do we have nothing to gain, but we suffer more because of it. We lose limbs, endure trauma, and give our lives. Our families have to watch flag-draped coffins lowered into the earth. Millions in this country without health care, jobs, or access to education must watch this government squander over $450 million a day on this occupation. Poor and working people in this country are sent to kill poor and working people in another country to make the rich richer. And without racism, soldiers would realize that they have more in common with the Iraqi people than they do with the billionaires who send us to war. I threw families onto the street in Iraq, only to come home and find families thrown onto the street in this country, in this tragic and unnecessary foreclosure crisis. We need to wake up and realize that our real enemies are not in some distant land. They're not people whose names we don't know and cultures we don't understand. The enemy is people we know very well and people we can identify. The enemy is a system that wages war when it's profitable. The enemy is the CEOs who lay us off from our jobs when it's profitable. It's the insurance companies who deny us health care when it's profitable. It's the banks who take away our homes when it's profitable. Our enemy is not 5,000 miles away. They are right here at home. If we organize and fight with our sisters and brothers, we can stop this war, we can stop this government, and we can create a better world.